Seraphina stood across the vast, polished mahogany of the conference table, her posture impeccable, her voice a flat line of corporate efficiency. She was reading from a crisp HR document as if it were a grocery list, each word a sterile, polished stone dropped into the silent room. "Effective immediately," she said, her gaze fixed somewhere just over my shoulder. "You are relieved of all operational duties at Sterling Logistics. A transitional exit package will be processed through legal." The words didn't seem to belong in the air between us. They felt foreign, incomprehensible, like a language I'd never heard before. This was Seraphina. My sister. My own blood, standing there in a $1,000 blazer, firing me from our family's company less than 24 hours after she had been crowned its CEO. The silence in the room was a living thing, thick and suffocating. I felt my own heartbeat in my ears, a frantic, panicked drum against the chilling quiet. "Is this a joke?" I finally managed to ask, but my voice came out as a whisper, a thread of sound so thin it barely disturbed the air. Seraphina didn't grant me the dignity of an answer. Her movements were fluid, detached. She slid the document across the gleaming table, a white rectangle of betrayal pushed in my direction. Then, she turned her attention to the next person in the room, Eleanor Vance. Eleanor. She had been with the company longer than either of us. She'd been our father's right hand, and in many ways, she had practically raised me in the hallways of this very office on the days Dad was too buried in work to make it to school pickups. She taught me how to file invoices when I was 10 and how to read a balance sheet when I was 16. Now, she looked like a stranger, her face a stoic mask, her eyes holding a deep, weary resignation. Seraphina handed her a second envelope, identical to mine. The clinical cruelty of the moment stole my breath. "You're offering her early retirement," I said, the words catching in my throat, each one a shard of glass. "Why? She's the backbone of this company. She is this company." Seraphina's response was immediate, practiced, as if she had rehearsed it in front of a mirror. "She's part of an outdated structure, Clara," she cut in, her tone leaving no room for argument. "This is about evolution, not emotion. We're streamlining for a new era of growth." Evolution. The word sounded obscene coming from her lips. Eleanor didn't fight. She didn't argue or plead. With a quiet dignity that broke my heart, she simply took the pen offered to her and signed the papers. The scratch of the nib on the document was the only sound in the universe. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than any boardroom tension I had ever experienced in my 17 years here. It was the sound of a legacy being dismantled. Seraphina, ever the professional, adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, gathered her stack of papers, and turned to leave without another word, without a single glance in my direction. The door clicked shut behind her, a sound of finality that echoed in the cavernous silence. I was alone with Eleanor, my entire world tilting on its axis. Numbness had set in, a cold, protective layer over the raw wound of betrayal. "Are you okay?" I asked her, the question feeling absurdly inadequate. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, her mask of composure finally beginning to crack. A flicker of pain, of profound disappointment, crossed her features. Then, before picking up her bag to leave, she reached over and pressed a small, folded sticky note into my hand, her fingers briefly squeezing mine. "Read it later," she whispered, her voice husky with emotion for the first time. "They made me choose, Clara. They made me choose." She walked out, leaving me alone in the room that suddenly felt like a tomb. It felt like years passed before I could command my fingers to move. Finally, I unfolded the small piece of yellow paper. Eleanor's handwriting was rushed, but as familiar to me as my own. It read, "If you're not here, it's not Sterling Logistics anymore." And just like that, the cold, hard truth slammed into me. I wasn't just being pushed out of a job. I wasn't just another name on a restructuring list. I was being erased from a legacy. The legacy my grandfather had built, my father had nurtured, and I had bled for. And the most terrifying part? I hadn't even seen it coming. The betrayal didn't begin in that cold, sterile conference room. The truth is, the ink on that termination letter was merely a formality. I had been slowly disappearing from my own family, from my own life, long before Seraphina signed my name off a contract. The real beginning was 17 years ago. I was 24, halfway through a promising MBA program, my future mapped out in front of me, bright and clear. Then the call came. Dad had a stroke. A massive one. It was the kind of call that cleaves your life into a before and an after. I remember dropping everything, the world narrowing to the humming fluorescent lights of a hospital corridor. Seraphina, who was already on the West Coast, building her brand as a media strategist, sent a lavish bouquet of lilies. I moved back home. I stepped into our father's schedule without ever being asked, slipping into his office chair, which still held the faint scent of his cologne. I learned the rhythms of the business not from a textbook, but from the ground up, from the loading docks to the executive suites. I was there before the sun rose, my car the only one in the parking lot, and I was still there when the night cleaning crew clocked out, the sky outside a deep, velvety black. I never left. For 17 years, Sterling Logistics was my life, my purpose, my everything, while Seraphina was curating a perfect life on social media, becoming a celebrated brand architect, a term I never truly understood. I was rebuilding the very foundation of our family's company with my own bare hands. When the financial crash of 2008 hit, it was like a tidal wave tearing through the industry. Our logistics firm, once a titan, was days away from total collapse. Clients we'd had for decades pulled their contracts overnight. Suppliers, spooked by the instability, froze our credit lines. The phones stopped ringing, except for calls from creditors. I remember the fear, a constant, metallic taste in my mouth. I worked 70, sometimes 80-hour weeks. I spent my days renegotiating every single contract, pleading with banks for extensions, and my nights quietly orchestrating the sale of half our fleet just to generate enough cash to stay afloat. I didn't ask for credit. I didn't call for a press conference to announce my heroic efforts. I just did what needed to be done, driven by a desperate need to prevent the company my grandfather had built from crumbling to dust on my watch. That Christmas, Seraphina flew in for the holidays. She breezed through the door wearing a brand new, impossibly chic Burberry coat, took one look at me, and said, "Clara, you look exhausted." The chasm between our two realities in that moment was staggering. What I didn't say then, what I never said to anyone, was that I hadn't slept through the night in 3 years. That the dark circles under my eyes were a permanent part of my face. That I had quietly cashed out my own IRA, my entire retirement savings, just to make payroll one terrifying month. That I had missed our own father's birthday because I was on a freezing tarmac in the middle of the night, personally overseeing an emergency shipment to save our single biggest client relationship. She smiled for the holiday photos, a beacon of effortless glamour, while I was in the parking lot on my phone, signing a loan extension that mortgaged our future a little deeper. We were sisters, but we were never the same after that. I kept telling myself it was okay. We were just wired differently. It was a story I repeated to myself like a mantra. Seraphina was the charm, I was the grit. She knew how to work a room. I knew how to work the numbers. Her talent was making people love the idea of Sterling Logistics. My talent was making sure Sterling Logistics actually existed. It didn't mean she didn't care, I reasoned. It just meant we loved the company in different ways. Or so I forced myself to believe. 2 nights after she fired me, sitting alone in my silent home office, I opened my laptop to start the grim task of sorting through old documents before my company accounts were deactivated forever. That's when I saw it. A folder, hidden deep within an archived legal shared drive, a place no one would ever look. The folder was titled, Succession Strategy, Seraphina. My hand trembled as I clicked it open, the contents spilled across my screen. Meeting transcripts, detailed strategy drafts, confidential memos exchanged with board members, all dated months before our father passed away. The language was clean, corporate, devoid of emotion, but the message was a dagger to the heart. Seraphina hadn't just waited for an opportunity. She had actively, meticulously laid the groundwork for her CEO takeover while her father was still in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. She had been positioning herself, undermining my role, and planning my exit before the dust had even settled on his final, devastating diagnosis. I stared at the screen, a wave of nausea rising in my throat. She hadn't just stepped into an open seat. She had carved it out for herself, carefully, discreetly, with a ruthlessness I had never imagined. She possessed. So, no, the betrayal didn't start on that Monday morning in the boardroom. It started the day she decided to take everything I had built, everything I had sacrificed for, all while pretending she hadn't even noticed I was doing the work. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon 2 summers ago, at Grandpa's old lake house. It was the kind of tranquil, sun-drenched day that feels too peaceful to be important, the kind you only recognize the significance of in hindsight. The sunlight was flickering through the tall pine trees, dappling the wooden deck in shifting patterns of gold. The faint, nostalgic smell of gasoline from his old fishing boat drifted across the water. He called me out to the porch, where he sat with 2 cups of black coffee and a heavy, rusted metal box resting on his lap. "You still drink it black?" he asked, his voice raspy but warm, already knowing the answer. I nodded, sinking into the worn wicker chair beside him. His joints cracked audibly as he shifted his weight, and I noticed for the first time how much thinner his frame had become, how the faded flannel shirt seemed to hang off his shoulders. He was aging faster than any of us were willing to admit. "I've been meaning to give you something," he said, his eyes serious as he rested the old box on the table between us. "But I needed to be sure." "Sure of what, Grandpa?" I asked, a small smile playing on my lips. Sure that you were the one who'd stay steady when the house was on fire. His words hung in the air, prophetic and heavy. He reached inside the box and pulled out 2 items. The first was a simple, elegant leather folder. The second was a pen. Not just any pen, but a sleek, black fountain pen, heavy in the hand, engraved with his initials. I remembered it from my childhood. It was his special pen, the one he only used for signing the major contracts, the kind of deals that built careers and changed lives. He placed both of them in my hands. The leather was cool and smooth, the pen reassuringly solid. That pen's been with me since the first freight deal I ever signed, he said. Don't lose it. I was still smiling, but a sense of confusion was beginning to creep in. What's all this about, Grandpa? He nodded at the folder. That, he said, is for when the world doubts you. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside were official legal documents. A 28% share in Sterling Logistics, all held in a private trust under my name. And then I saw it, a clause, handwritten at the bottom of the page in his familiar, steady script, signed by both him and his attorney. It stated, in clear, unambiguous language, that if I were ever terminated from my position at the company without documented cause, the full voting rights and absolute veto power associated with his entire original stake in the company would be transferred to me. Instantly. No board vote required. No room for negotiation. My throat tightened, a knot of disbelief and apprehension forming. You really think it could come to this? I whispered, looking from the document to his weathered face. His expression was somber, his eyes filled with a sad wisdom. I think people change when power is on the table, Clara, he said quietly. And I think your sister loves the idea of a legacy far more than she loves the weight of earning it. I looked out at the lake, its surface still and golden under the late afternoon sun. My hands gripped the pen, my knuckles white. I didn't want to believe him. I didn't want to imagine a world where Seraphina would turn on me, where the company we were both meant to inherit would turn on itself. But my grandfather was not a man who spoke without reason. Promise me, he added, his voice low and firm, promise me you won't use it unless you absolutely have to. But if that day comes, you use it without hesitation, understand? That memory, that solemn promise, returned to me like a tidal wave as I stood outside the boardroom 2 days after Seraphina had fired me. The leather folder was in one hand, Grandpa's pen in the other. I had kept them locked away in a safe, a relic of a conversation I had hoped was just an old man's paranoia. But now, I understood. The only thing more dangerous than using them was not using them. After Seraphina's final, cold words on that Monday morning, I didn't take the main elevator. I packed the few personal items I kept in my office, 2 framed photos, one of my father and me, one of my grandfather, the fountain pen he gave me, and a resilient little plant I'd nursed through 8 brutal fiscal years. I slid it all into a single, plain cardboard box, the kind we used for interns, the kind we used when we had to let people go. The irony was a bitter pill. I chose the side stairwell. I couldn't bear the thought of standing inside that glass elevator, the silent, judgmental eyes of everyone on each floor watching me descend, a literal and metaphorical fall from grace. As I walked through the hallways, a ghost in my own company. No one would meet my gaze. People I'd hired, people I'd mentored, people I had personally fought to protect during the last round of layoffs, they all kept their heads down, suddenly intensely focused on their keyboards or pretending to be on urgent phone calls. I wasn't surprised. Seraphina was CEO now. To acknowledge me was to risk association with the old guard, with the past. And in a company like ours, loyalty was a currency only as valuable as the last quarterly report. But then I saw her. Eleanor. She was standing near the back entrance, her arms crossed, her jaw tight with a silent fury. She didn't say a word. She just watched me approach, and as I passed, she handed me another yellow sticky note, this one folded neatly in half. She gave me a single, sharp nod, a look that said she knew exactly what I'd done for this place, what I'd sacrificed. And then she walked away without looking back. I waited until I was inside my car in the echoing emptiness of the parking garage to open it. The note contained just 5 words, written in her neat, familiar handwriting, they are not worth your silence. No sign-off, no name. Just the raw, unvarnished truth. I sat there for 20 minutes, maybe more, just staring at the monolithic glass and steel building I had helped save more times than anyone inside would ever know or admit. Memories flooded me. I remembered dragging a sleeping bag into my office during the 2009 crash, surviving on vending machine coffee and sheer willpower. I remembered patiently walking my father through his own retirement plan after his stroke, his hands trembling as he struggled to sign the papers. And I remembered the gut-wrenching sight of Seraphina's perfectly airbrushed face on the company's new rebrand banners, plastered across the lobby under the slogan, "The Next Chapter of Sterling Logistics." As if my chapter had never even been written. That was the worst part of it all. Not the firing, not even the deep, personal betrayal from my own sister. It was the erasure. The feeling of being rendered invisible, like all those years of sweat, sacrifice, and struggle were nothing more than background noise in someone else's meticulously crafted spotlight. When I finally got home, I powered up my laptop, intending to methodically cancel my work accounts, trying to impose some sense of practical order on the chaos of my life. That's when I saw the notification. An internal HR memo, forwarded to my personal inbox, clearly by mistake. By someone who hadn't gotten the memo about my immediate termination. The subject line was a punch to the gut: confidential, succession strategy, Clara phase out. It was dated 6 months ago. My name was there, in cold, sterile bullet points. Targeted transition from ops. Minimize influence with board. Position: Seraphina as strategic evolution. No public exit messaging. Keep low visibility. My stomach turned to ice. This hadn't been an impulsive power grab. This was a strategy. A cold, calculated execution plan. And I was the target. They hadn't just fired me. They had been planning, for months, to erase me. Piece by quiet, methodical piece. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of Arthur Jennings's law office, the heartbreak had crystallized into something else entirely. Something harder, sharper, and far more dangerous. I wasn't there as a heartbroken daughter or a betrayed sister or even a former executive. I was there as the legal majority shareholder of Sterling Logistics. And I was there as the only person left who was willing to protect it from itself. Arthur Jennings, our family's lawyer for 3 generations, greeted me with a quiet, profound sadness. His office smelled faintly of old books, wood polish, and an unwavering loyalty that seemed to belong to a bygone era. He gestured for me to sit, his expression kind but grave. I heard what Seraphina did, Clara, he said gently, his voice a low rumble. Your grandfather, he would have expected this moment to come. I didn't need to explain. I simply pulled the trust documents from my bag, the same leather folder my grandpa had handed me 2 summers ago on that sun-drenched porch overlooking the lake, and slid them across his vast mahogany desk, along with the engraved pen. Arthur read through the pages without rushing, his eyes sharp and focused. He nodded, recognizing the familiar ink of my grandfather's signature. His finger paused on the handwritten clause at the bottom, the clause that changed everything. Termination without cause, he murmured, reading the words aloud as if to confirm their power. Triggers full activation of voting rights, including corporate veto power, effective immediately. My voice, when I spoke, was steady now, purged of the earlier tremors of shock and grief. She didn't give me a reason, Arthur. No documentation, no performance reviews, nothing. Just evolution, not emotion. Arthur looked up from the papers, a grim, determined light in his eyes. Then she gave you everything you need, he replied. We'll file this with the board secretariat before their quarterly session tomorrow morning. Once it's submitted, your authority becomes legal, binding, and uncontested. A slow surge of purpose began to rise in my chest. It wasn't the sweet taste of victory. Not yet. But it was traction. It was a way forward from the darkness. Then, Arthur paused, a look of reluctance crossing his face. He opened another file on his desk. I need you to see something else, he said, his tone shifting, becoming even more serious. He slid a stack of state business filings toward me. My eyes narrowed as I scanned the documents. Corporate entity formations, shell accounts, a complex web of quiet asset transfers. And then I saw a name, buried deep in the fine print of the paperwork, a name that hit me like a physical blow. Julian Croft. Seraphina's ex-boyfriend. You're kidding me, I whispered, my breath catching in my chest. I read on, the scale of her deception becoming horrifyingly clear. She was systematically transferring company assets, valuable freight routes, key vendor contracts, even the trademark on Sterling's much-publicized sustainability program, all being funneled through a newly formed Delaware LLC. And Julian Croft was listed as the acting partner. That's illegal, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Or at the very least, it's fraudulent misrepresentation. Arthur nodded slowly. But unless someone with the power to challenge it does so, it just becomes business as usual. I stared at the documents, my fingers curling so tightly around Grandpa's pen that my knuckles turned white. Seraphina hadn't just betrayed me. She was hollowing out the company from the inside, planting her name on a crumbling facade while secretly selling off the foundation. She wasn't building a legacy, she was orchestrating a heist. I want every document prepared, I said, my voice now hard as steel as I stood up. And I want the board to see every single page of this before she even knows I'm coming. Arthur leaned back, a flicker of something sharp and approving in his expression. You're not just fighting for your place anymore, Clara. No, I said, my gaze fixed on the skyline outside his window. I'm fighting for the truth. And now, I wasn't just reacting to her betrayal. I was coming for her throne, armed with paper, with law, and with the one thing she had always, fatally, underestimated in me, my resilience. Seraphina didn't flinch when I walked into the boardroom. But the way her fingers froze mid-swipe across the surface of her presentation remote told me everything I needed to know. The other board members looked up, their expressions shifting in slow motion from puzzlement to cautious apprehension. I wasn't supposed to be there. According to the memo that had been circulated just that morning, I no longer had operational relevance. But as of 8 a.m., I had something far more permanent. I had voting authority. And I had the truth. Good morning, I said, my voice calm and clear as I placed the leather folder gently on the table in front of my empty chair. I promise I won't take up much of your time. Seraphina's professional smile, the one she deployed for cameras and hostile negotiations, snapped into place, but it didn't reach her eyes. Clara, this meeting is for board members only. I think you're in the wrong. I have documents, I interrupted, my tone still quiet but cutting through her words like a razor, proving that my recent termination was conducted without cause. In direct violation of the trust agreement signed by our grandfather, the founder of this company. I let that sink in. As of that termination, I continued, making eye contact with each person around the table. I now hold 28% controlling shares. And full veto rights, as stipulated per the original Articles of Incorporation. Arthur Jennings, seated near the end of the table like a silent sentinel, gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of confirmation. His mere presence lent an undeniable weight of legitimacy to my claim. This was real. This was happening. Seraphina recovered quickly, her mask of composure settling back into place. Let's not make this a personal drama, Clara. This is about the future of the company. It's already personal, Seraphina, I said, my voice never rising, but carrying a new weight of authority. Because what you did wasn't just about removing me from a role. It was calculated. I slid copies of the trust agreement across the table to each board member. I watched their faces as they read. Some leaned forward, their brows furrowed in concentration. Others sat back, their expressions a mixture of shock and dawning understanding. And I wish that was all, I continued, sliding my phone onto the center of the table. But it's not. I tapped the screen. And then, Seraphina's voice, clear, confident, and utterly damning, filled the silent room. If Croft's firm covers the rebrand and the Westyard development costs, I'll authorize the asset transfer. Quietly. No board vote. I'll frame it as a sustainability restructuring. Silence. Absolute, deafening silence. The words hovered in the air, poisonous and undeniable. I didn't look at my sister. I didn't need to. I could feel the heat of her panic and fury radiating across the table as the full implications of the recording landed, hard and fast, in the minds of everyone present. You've been selling our core contracts to a rival firm, run by your ex-boyfriend. In exchange for private capital support, I said evenly, narrating her crime for the stunned audience. Julian Croft's name is all over the filings. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny, to explain, but for the first time in her life, no sound came out. Chairman Davies, a man whose face was usually a mask of polite indifference, cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense atmosphere. Where did this recording come from, Miss Sterling? He asked, his eyes fixed on me. I paused for a beat. It was sent to me anonymously, I said, choosing my words carefully. But I recognized the voice instantly. It wasn't a complete lie. The sender had used a masked, encrypted account. But only later, in the elevator with Arthur, did I glance again at the email's metadata. The file name was labeled e_vance_final_audio.mp3. Eleanor Vance. She hadn't just left with quiet dignity. She had left me a weapon. And Seraphina, in all her strategic brilliance, never saw it coming. The silence that followed the recording was not empty. It was charged, electric, like the seconds before a lightning strike. Seraphina's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles pulsing. Her posture was ramrod straight, but the perfect, impenetrable mask was finally, irrevocably cracking. I saw it in the way she blinked too quickly, in the way her knuckles had turned white where she gripped the edge of the podium. Marcus Thorne, our largest outside investor and a man who had once been Seraphina's most vocal champion, was the first to speak. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together on the table, his gaze sharp and analytical. I've reviewed the numbers over the last decade, he said quietly, his voice carrying immense weight in the room. He turned his head slowly to look at Seraphina. You've been here for less than a year. Clara, he said, now turning his direct, appraising gaze on me, rebuilt this company after the 2008 crash. She personally negotiated every major client retention contract that kept us alive. She digitized our entire operations when we were still using paper ledgers. She is the reason we are profitable today. He paused, letting his words sink in, then delivered the final blow. She built this. We follow her. The shift in the room was immediate and palpable. It was like a dam breaking. Other board members began to nod in agreement, their caution replaced by a grim resolve. A motion was suggested, then formally tabled, to reinstate Clara Sterling as interim CEO and to suspend Seraphina immediately, pending a full internal audit. I said nothing. I just sat there, keeping my expression neutral, while a wave of heat rushed under my skin. My fingers curled around the heavy brass pen my grandfather had given me, the one I hadn't used since the last contract he himself had ever signed. It was Seraphina's voice that cut through the murmurs of assent, a sound that was sharp, unstable, and laced with venom. You planned this, she snapped, her eyes, now stripped of all their corporate polish, locked on me with pure hatred. This entire setup. The firing, the silence, the timing, it was all an act. It was a trap. I held her gaze, my own calm and unwavering. No, Seraphina, I replied softly. It was a response. You've always wanted to prove you were smarter, she spat, taking a step forward, her voice rising with each word. You've been playing the martyr for years, the quiet, hardworking saint, just waiting for your moment to pounce. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Her own words were doing more damage than I ever could. Right there, in front of the very people she had spent a year trying to impress, Seraphina was revealing what I had always known but never spoken aloud, that she didn't have the temperament, the strategy, or the fundamental restraint to lead. Chairman Davies raised a hand, his face stern. That's enough, Seraphina. This is not a courtroom. He was right. It was a boardroom. But the verdict had already been delivered. The vote was called. 7 in favor of my appointment. 2 abstaining. None in her defense. Seraphina stood motionless for a single, stunned beat. Then, she turned, her heels echoing sharply on the marble floor as she walked out of the room, out of the company, out of the life she had tried to steal. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I breathed. Slowly, fully. Not because the fight was over, but because I was finally standing exactly where I had earned the right to be. The vote had been cast. The signatures were inked. And just like that, Seraphina Sterling was no longer CEO of Sterling Logistics. No applause followed. Her dramatic exit. There were no raised voices, no triumphant cheers. There was just a heavy stillness in the room, the kind of profound quiet that follows the collapse of something built on a foundation of illusion. She left the boardroom without a single look back, her shoulders stiff, the silence trailing behind her like smoke. I didn't chase her. I didn't gloat. I just remained seated, letting the room breathe without her suffocating ambition in it. An hour later, I stood before the company's executive team in that same conference room. Some of them looked relieved. Others looked rattled, their faces pale with uncertainty. All of them waited, their eyes on me, waiting to see if I would come in swinging, ready to purge the company of anyone who had aligned with my sister. I didn't. There won't be any revenge firings, I said, my voice even and steady. No grand speeches, no backroom deals. Just one immediate action. I paused, letting them absorb the shift in tone. Every financial transfer made in the past 6 months will be subject to a full, transparent review. The findings will be documented and reported publicly to the board and to our external auditors. I saw someone exhale slowly. Someone else gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. That includes any shadow LLCs, shell corporations, or internal promotions authorized without full board consent, I added, my eyes sweeping across the room. We're not here to burn things down. We're here to repair the cracks in the foundation before they become fractures. I didn't need to punish Seraphina. The truth was already doing that for me, dismantling her reputation with every new document that came to light. Later that night, alone in the quiet of my new office, my old office, really, I powered on the company's restricted internal portal. A high-level administrative tool I hadn't had access to since my termination. Arthur had made sure my full clearance was restored within hours of the board meeting. It was time to see how deep the rot went. I opened Seraphina's executive correspondence folder. There, buried among polished pitch decks and glossy rebranding proposals, was a file that made my blood run cold. Personnel Realignment Proposal, Phase 2. I clicked it open. The document detailed a sweeping, systematic plan for the dismissal of dozens of employees. The criteria for termination wasn't performance, it was their association with legacy operations. They were, in her words, remnants of our father's era. Names I knew like my own. Eleanor, of course. Patrick from Fleet Management, a man who'd worked for my father for 30 years. Angela from distribution, who had started in the mailroom and worked her way up to department head. These were the people who had built the heart and soul of the company long before Seraphina had ever expressed an interest in it. She hadn't just fired me. She had been preparing to systematically erase every last trace of our father, of our shared history, of us. As I sat there, the weight of her treachery settling upon me, my phone buzzed on the desk. A text from an unknown number. I opened it. There were no words. Just a photo. It was a picture of the small, resilient plant from my old office, now sitting on Eleanor's desk, bathed in the warm glow of her desk lamp. I stared at it for a long moment, a slow smile spreading across my face. I didn't reclaim this company to prove that I was right. I reclaimed it to protect the people and the principles that had been so casually cast aside. And I would lead with the one thing my sister never understood. Discipline without vengeance. Strength without cruelty. There was no time for celebration. The morning after Seraphina's unceremonious exit, I arrived at the office at 6:15 a.m. Just as I always used to. There were no cameras to greet me, no press releases announcing my return. Just a quiet, solitary walk through the grand lobby I hadn't entered freely in weeks. The walls were still plastered with her slick marketing slogans, a new era, a bold vision, but now, they felt like relics of a failed regime. Now, it would be my vision that redefined this place. By 7 a.m., I had gathered all the department heads in the main conference room. Most of them looked exhausted, their faces etched with the stress of the past 24 hours. Some were still unsure of where they stood. But they all showed up. That, in itself, meant something. We're not chasing flash anymore, I said, standing at the head of the table where my sister had stood just a day before. I use no slides, no theatrics. We're going back to our fundamentals. Integrity. Reliability. Accountability. There was no applause, but there were nods. Slow, deliberate nods of understanding and, I hoped, of respect. In the world of sterling logistics, that was more than enough. Within days, I dissolved the shadow task forces and vanity projects Seraphina had created. I reinstated key mid-level managers who had been quietly sidelined for being too loyal to the old ways. And I brought Eleanor Vance back, not to her old job, but as senior advisor of legacy operations, a new role I created specifically for her. She cried when I offered it to her, then she accepted with a handshake as firm and steady as I remembered. Our first major win, the first sign that the ship was truly turning, came the following week. Everline Logistics, a cornerstone partner we had nearly lost under Seraphina's chaotic leadership, requested a renegotiation. They had been days away from pulling their multi-million-dollar contract. Now, their CEO was on the phone, asking for a 10-year commitment. "We trust you, Clara," he said, his voice warm with relief. "You're the reason we signed with Sterling in the first place, all those years ago." When the new contract arrived, I sat alone in my office, the lights low and the blinds drawn against the afternoon sun. I reached into the top drawer of the desk and pulled out the heavy brass pen my grandfather had given me 2 summers ago, its side still etched with his initials. "For when the world doubts you." I clicked it once, the sound a satisfying finality in the quiet room, and then I signed my name. The rebuild had officially begun, but not everyone had moved on so easily. Later that afternoon, there was a quiet, hesitant knock on my open door. It was Leo, one of the youngest analysts from the business intelligence unit. He couldn't have been more than 26, and he looked impossibly nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Can I talk to you, Miss Sterling?" "Off the record," he asked, his eyes darting toward the hallway. I closed my laptop and nodded. "Of course, Leo. Come in. And please, call me Clara." He sat down, his gaze fixed on the floor as he spoke. "About a month ago," he began, his voice low, "Seraphina? Miss Sterling, she offered me a promotion. Director level. Double my salary." I stayed perfectly still, listening. She said all I had to do was feed her updates on what certain departments were doing. Especially the old guard teams, she called them. From your era. She wanted me to report on who was still loyal to the past. I raised an eyebrow. "And did you?" He shook his head quickly, his eyes finally meeting mine. "No. But I recorded our conversations. Just in case." He pulled a small USB drive from his pocket and set it carefully on the edge of my desk. "You should have this. I don't want anything in return. I want to work for someone who doesn't treat loyalty like it's a threat." I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw something familiar. Not fear, but conviction. A quiet integrity. "Leo," I said softly. "You are exactly the kind of leader this company will need to build the next decade." His shoulders, which had been tensed up to his ears, visibly dropped with relief. "Thank you, Clara." After he left, I held the small drive in one hand and Grandpa's pen in the other. The past had tried to bury me, to erase me. But the future was mine to write. One signature, one loyal voice at a time.